California flooding. January 2023. Evacuations ordered as mudslide and flood risks grow. Thousands of residents were told to leave their homes as heavy rain caused flooding in parts of California. Relentless storms have killed at least 17 people since late December. Forecasters warned Californians to expect unusual bouts of hail, lightning storms, wind gusts of up to 60 miles an hour, and possibly even tornadoes to go along with the heavy rain for much of Tuesday. Experts say the cost of the damage done by the storms could top $1 billion. Evacuations were ordered on Monday for residents in Montecito in Santa Barbara County and parts of Santa Cruz County, about 70 miles south of San Francisco, as creeks and rivers topped their banks, threatened homes, and washed away at least one bridge. Many of those who left Montecito returned home on Tuesday under sunny skies. Rescuers resumed the search on Tuesday for a 5-year-old boy who was swept away by floodwaters in San Luis Obispo County on the Central Coast. The authorities called off their search on Monday when conditions became too dangerous. Looking ahead, 7 more inches of rain could fall in many parts of California over the next several days, as yet another enormous cyclone that is forming off the coast slams areas of Northern California and the Pacific Northwest on Wednesday. After 17 days of precipitation in much of California, it looks like the rainfall should shift a little further north. Another system enters the state this weekend but doesn't look as strong, but even a weak atmospheric river with mild precipitation can cause issues given California's saturated ground. Gradually, it looks like we'll have a pattern change that will allow the spigot to turn off. San Francisco buses were delayed and rerouted on Wednesday because of flooding and downed trees across the city. In the most dramatic incident, a large tree toppled onto a city bus near Union Square. There were 427 public and charter schools that closed on Tuesday in California because of the weather. That means more than 185,000 students didn't have classes. Emergency crews rescued several people from sinkholes, while others were trapped in their homes by mudslides. Some residents rushed to escape rising floodwaters that cut through urban and rural areas alike. In parts of Gualala, a rural town on California's coast some 120 miles north of San Francisco, homes and businesses haven't had electricity for nearly a week as storm after storm has pummeled the state. Phone service has been down in much of the town, long lines have formed at the local gas station, and the community grocery store has been rationing ice after the power went out last Wednesday morning. In other areas of Gualala, home to about 2,000 people in southern Mendocino County, trees fell on roadways as well as people's homes and cars. Many residents and businesses have generators, because the town's remote location often means it takes hours for power to be restored after a storm. But this outage has stretched longer than any other in recent memory. The propane tank that fuels her generator is running low, and with so many people relying on propane, people are struggling to secure more. Pacific Gas and Electric has said that it will be restored by 10 p.m. on Wednesday. The restoration date has been delayed 3 times already, and more rains and wind are in the forecast. It's a very resilient group of people who live along the Northern California coast. A steady rain was pelting the city of Norco, dubbed Horsetown, USA. Several uncovered corrals and horse arenas were filled with water, forcing horses inside, to barn stalls. The Hidden Valley Wildlife Area, popular in part for its riding trails, was also closed. In San Francisco, pea-sized hail pelted roofs and windows intermittently in between rain, occasional thunder, and even brief moments of sunshine. A flash flood warning was in effect throughout the city. Rescuers resumed searching on Tuesday for a 5-year-old boy who was swept away by fast-rising floodwaters in central California the day before. Officials in San Luis Obispo County said they hoped a reprieve in the ongoing storms would allow them to locate the child before the next band of rain. The authorities identified the missing boy as Kyle Doan, describing him as 4 feet tall and 52 pounds, with short, dirty blonde hair and hazel eyes. He was carried away from a car on Monday morning when his mother drove across a surging creek near the town of San Miguel. His mother was rescued by nearby residents, but the boy disappeared with fast-moving waters down a creek that feeds into the Salinas River, officials said. Rescuers were forced to suspend their search on Monday afternoon, about 5 hours after the boy was swept away, because weather conditions made it too dangerous. They resumed on Tuesday morning at about 10:30 a.m. The rescue teams included divers and detectives, drones and helicopters that were scouring a broad area for the child, said Tony Cipala, a sheriff's office spokesman. Water was still raging down the creek where he disappeared, making it tough to gauge how far the boy may have been downstream, he said. The creek had been dry for years before the recent storms. The boy was wearing a black puffer jacket, blue jeans, and blue and gray Nike tennis shoes when he was swept away, officials said. Central California was among the hardest hit by the storms on Monday, with hillsides collapsing on highways and flooded rivers and creeks. Another motorist drowned in the county on Monday. Forecasters said showers would continue in the San Luis Obispo area on Tuesday afternoon, with winds gusting up to 45 miles per hour. A Tesla crashed into a swimming pool on Tuesday in Pasadena. PFD and PPD are on scene 700 block. West California Boulevard. A Tesla driver hit the accelerator instead of the brake, drove through a wall and into a pool. 3 occupants in vehicle including a child. Good Samaritans jumped into the pool and rescued the occupants. As strong as the storms of recent weeks have been, scientists and meteorologists are still waiting to see whether they will come close to equaling the most severe winter weather crisis in the West Coast's modern history. Historical comparisons are tricky. Such storms' effects can vary significantly between northern and southern California and between different river basins. There isn't just one metric that captures everything about how big or how destructive one of these weeks-long storm sequences was. For California as a whole, a megastorm from the Civil War era is scientists' main benchmark for wild winter weather. Beginning in late 1861, atmospheric rivers pummeled the West with wave after wave of rain and snow. Swaths of the Central Valley became unbroken expanses of water. Sacramento residents navigated their city's deluged streets on rafts buoyed by whiskey barrels. Were the exact same weather event to strike the Pacific coast today, its effects would be very different. Back then, California didn't have the dams, levees and bypasses that it now has to corral and divert floodwaters. But it also didn't have nearly as many residents, or as much property and economic activity. Our understanding of the 1861-62 storms is imperfect. Without satellite data and other precise measurements, scientists have had to piece together a picture from journals, newspaper reports and scattered observations of rain and flood levels. Their sense, though, is that those storms were much more extreme than anything the West has seen since. These storms, while impressive, don't tell anybody in Santa Barbara they didn't get hammered by this thing, but it's just not in the same league as 1861-62, where it encompassed bigger storms over wider areas, said Larry Schick, a meteorologist previously with the Army Corps of Engineers. San Francisco, for instance, has received more than 12 inches of rain in the last 15 days, according to Jan Null, a meteorologist formerly with the National Weather Service in California. This is still less than the nearly 20 inches that fell over the city during a 15-day stretch of January 1862. That month, San Francisco got over 24 inches of rain in total. Forecasts on Tuesday suggested that storm activity over California could taper off after the middle of next week, potentially before precipitation levels break those 19th-century records. In Montecito, where residents were ordered to evacuate, the air was filled with the smell of mud and the low, distant sound of small boulders rumbling through fast-flowing creeks. Most businesses were closed, and usually busy streets were largely empty. Rain and hail were pelting downtown Oakland in spurts on Tuesday afternoon, as thunder rumbled overhead. Forecasters from the National Weather Service warned of lightning and damaging wind, encouraging residents to seek shelter in a sturdy structure. In Studio City, a neighborhood in Los Angeles, some residents were sheltering in place after about 4 feet of mud and debris covered a road. The tires of some parked cars disappeared in the muck, and firefighters were knocking on doors to check on residents. 2 motorists were killed on Tuesday after a tree fell on State Route 99 just north of Visalia in the San Joaquin Valley, the California Highway Patrol said. The toppled tree caused multiple vehicles to crash around 6 a.m. The deaths bring the overall toll to 17 since late December. Almost 49,000 people were under evacuation orders and another 50,000 were under evacuation warnings across California on Tuesday morning, state officials said in their first official accounting of the state of the latest storm. More than 220,000 utility customers were without power in the state, according to Brian Ferguson, a spokesman for the governor's Office of Emergency Services. The oceanside counties of Santa Cruz, Monterey and Santa Barbara, all of which lie between San Francisco and Los Angeles, have borne the brunt of the impacts so far. In Monterey County, flooding that began Monday has forced evacuations along the Carmel and Salinas rivers. In Santa Cruz County, the wind, rain and tides have battered buildings and infrastructure along the beaches. A number of communities in Santa Barbara County have been ordered evacuated, including Montecito, the site of a series of devastating mudslides 5 years ago that killed 23 people. More than 200 schools across the state are closed on Tuesday for weather-related reasons, according to the California Department of Education. The battering from a series of storms has made a mess of major roads and highways across California. A massive boulder blocked a canyon road in Malibu, a hillside crumbled onto a highway in Fresno, and stretches of the well-traveled Highway 101 were turned into rivers. In the city of South San Francisco, extreme winds peeled back part of an apartment building's roof Tuesday morning, allowing water to enter 2 apartments and forcing the evacuation of 10 residents, said Matt Sampson, the city's deputy fire chief. No one was injured. After several years of intense drought, California is now being pummeled by weeks of heavy rain. As the state's residents are discovering, the two opposite meteorological conditions can combine to make for severe mudslides. In a prolonged drought, soils dry out, harden and become less permeable to water, said Dan Sugar, a geoscientist at the University of Calgary in Canada. Water can pond quickly on the hardened soil, and, depending on the terrain, will eventually run off. On steep slopes, the water rushing downhill can accelerate, eroding soil in its path, picking up rocks and debris and joining with other rivulets of water to make a growing and potentially destructive mudslide. California's drought has also helped fuel major wildfires in recent years, and post-wildfire slopes are especially susceptible to mudslides. On Monday, concern about potential mudslides prompted evacuations in Montecito, Calif., where 23 people were killed 5 years ago in a slide that occurred a month after a wildfire on the hills nearby. After trees and other vegetation are killed in a fire, their roots weaken over the next several years, making the soil they are in less stable. By vaporizing waxy compounds in vegetation that are then deposited in the soil, extremely hot fires can also make soils water repellent, increasing surface runoff when the rains come and raising the risk of a mudslide. Mudslides, which are also referred to as debris flows, tend to be shallow, eroding the topmost layer of soil and picking up rocks and other debris on the surface. But heavy rains can also cause major landslides, when a large part of a slope becomes saturated with water to great depth, altering the pressure between soil particles and making the slope unstable. The rugged hills along California's coast are especially susceptible to this kind of landslide. In 2005, houses in the small town of La Conchita, just below the coastal highway, Route 1, in Southern California, were buried when the hillside gave way, killing 10 people. Some major landslides may be moving in slow motion for years before heavy rain triggers a much faster moving failure. After the 2017 slide in Big Sur in Northern California that is considered the largest in state history, when about 6 million cubic yards of debris slid across Route 1, NASA researchers used radar data to study the slope. They found that it had been moving at a rate of about 7 inches a year for about a decade. The state will also be spending $2.7 billion on measures aimed at limiting wildfires, and $8.6 billion on water and drought management, he said. After his budget presentation, Newsom is heading down to the state's hard-hit Central Coast. In Santa Barbara, firefighters, sheriff's deputies and other emergency personnel were heading out to assess conditions. Scott Safechuk, a spokesman for the Santa Barbara County Fire Department, said there were more than 100 abandoned vehicles in the county and teams had made 7 swift water rescues over the past day. Dangerously large breaking waves of 20 to 25 feet will be possible along the central and northern coasts of California. Surf could also reach 6 to 15 feet along some Southern California beaches on Tuesday and into Wednesday. In the suburban Chatsworth neighborhood of Los Angeles, a sinkhole 15 feet deep opened up and swallowed 2 cars on Monday, trapping 2 people in one of the cars with rainwater gushing in, according to the Los Angeles City Fire Department. They were rescued with minor injuries. More than a foot of rain has been recorded across portions of coastal California over the past 2 days. A few spots in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties received more than 16 inches, according to the National Weather Service. Parts of Union Station in downtown Los Angeles were flooded with several inches of water on Tuesday morning. LA Metro officials warned commuters to expect major delays throughout the system, which serves tens of thousands of Angelenos each day, after several trains were canceled because of debris on tracks and damage to overhead wires. More than 220,000 customers in California were without electricity on Tuesday morning, according to PowerOutage.us. Pacific Gas and Electric, a California utility company, said in a statement that there had been more than 100 cloud-to-ground lightning strikes as of 5:30 a.m. There are no updates this morning on the search for a missing 5-year-old boy in San Luis Obispo, who was swept away in floodwaters on Monday as his mom drove him to school. Rescuers had to suspend their search at about 3 p.m. when the storm made it too dangerous to continue, according to the county sheriff's office. The boy's mother was rescued by nearby residents. The damage from weeks of storms and flooding in California could exceed $1 billion, according to the state's emergency agency and private weather forecasters. That toll comes on the heels of 2022, one of the worst on record for large-scale weather and climate disasters around the United States, according to data released Tuesday by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's likely that this is going to be at least several $1 billion, said Jonathan Porter, chief meteorologist at AccuWeather. It will unfortunately join the club of billion-dollar disasters. The nation was struck last year by 18 disasters that caused more than $1 billion each in damage. That's the third highest number in the 43 years that NOAA has been keeping records. The only other years on record with more billion-dollar disasters, adjusted for inflation, are 2020 and 2021. At the top of the 2022 list is Hurricane Ian, which caused $113 billion in damage, the country's third costliest hurricane since 1980 behind Hurricanes Katrina and Harvey. The drought and heat wave in the western and central United States was the second worst disaster in 2022, causing $22 billion in damage. All told, last year's 18 large-scale disasters caused $165 billion in damage, according to NOAA, greater than the annual economic output of West Virginia and Alaska put together. Here are some other reasons last year's disasters stood out. Hurricane Nicole, which struck Florida on November 10, was the first November hurricane to make landfall in the United States in almost 40 years. Typhoon Merbok, which damaged homes in Alaska, was the strongest storm to enter the Bering Sea during September in 70 years. Alaska passed the million-acre mark for land burned by wildfires on June 18, the earliest in the past 32 years. Average temperatures in Alaska were 2.6 degrees Fahrenheit higher than normal last year, almost double the temperature increase in the contiguous United States. At least 40% of the land mass of the mainland United States has been in drought for the past 119 weeks, longer than at any other time in the 22 years the U.S. Drought Monitor has been keeping track. More tornadoes were reported in March 2022 than any other March on record, going back to 1950. There were 1,331, 3 times the average for the month. The Stockton Unified School District, which serves nearly 40,000 students, has canceled classes for the second straight day because of storm damage to its campuses. The district also said that food supplies for school meals spoiled because of prolonged power outages. The Sacramento City Unified School District is resuming classes today at most campuses, after shutting down on Monday. The 4 Malibu schools in the Santa Monica Malibu School District switched to remote learning on Tuesday because of the storm, according to the district's website. Parents were advised to watch for more information from their respective schools. The next few days will bring even more rain to California. As rain lashed Southern California on Monday night, parts of Los Angeles County experienced flooding, an unusual twist for a typically dry, sunny place where people tend to worry about droughts. A flash flood warning for southwestern Los Angeles County that had been issued before 7 p.m. expired early Tuesday. The warning affected nearly 8 million of the more than 10 million residents in the county, the most populous in the United States. The full extent of flooding in the Los Angeles area was not immediately clear in the pre-dawn hours of Tuesday morning. California's Central Coast, where officials had ordered evacuations on Monday in a coastal enclave of Santa Barbara County, appeared to be the hardest-hit area of a state that has been battered in recent weeks by powerful waves of moisture, known as atmospheric rivers. But the Weather Service had warned on Monday evening that downtown Los Angeles, Malibu, Hollywood, and Beverly Hills were among the places that would experience flash flooding. And as more than an inch of rain fell in some areas of the county that night, early images showed cars partially submerged by floods near downtown. The Los Angeles Fire Department also told an NBC affiliate that firefighters had rescued 2 people who were trapped inside a vehicle at the bottom of a sinkhole that opened in the Chatsworth area, north of downtown LA. And at Los Angeles International Airport, a so-called ground stop issued shortly after 8 p.m. by the Federal Aviation Administration slowed the pace of takeoffs and landings for about an hour amid high winds, said Victoria Spilabot, a spokeswoman for the airport. That usually happens at airports across the country, but we don't often have a ground stop, mostly because Los Angeles has pretty good weather year-round, she said. So this type of storm is not typical for us. More bad weather was in the forecast. The Weather Service said early Tuesday morning that as the heavy precipitation in Southern California was beginning to taper, a new and energetic, low-pressure system was gathering strength offshore. Heavy precipitation was expected across much of the state on Tuesday, and parts of Southern California could see up to 7 inches of rain over the next few days, the agency said. The one good aspect of the recent heavy rains has been relief from the persistent drought that has been plaguing large portions of the West, it added. The flooding in Los Angeles on Monday night capped a frantic day in Santa Barbara County, where officials ordered thousands of residents to quickly evacuate the coastal enclave of Montecito amid fears of mudslides in an area where wildfires have made soils and vegetation less stable. Up to a foot of rain was expected to soak Montecito's already drenched hillsides. And the evacuation orders were issued 5 years to the day that a deadly torrent of mud and boulders rushed through neighborhoods in that mansion community, killing 23 people and turning it into a disaster area. We're in the midst of a series of significant and powerful storms, Sheriff Bill Brown of Santa Barbara County said in a briefing. Currently, we're experiencing a storm that is causing many problems and has the potential to cause major problems across our county, especially in the burn scar areas. Late Sunday, President Biden approved an emergency declaration for 17 counties in California, allowing for federal assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Department of Homeland Security in relief and rescue efforts. Elsewhere along the Central Coast, one person was killed by floodwater while trying to navigate a submerged road in San Luis Obispo County, north of Santa Barbara, officials said on Monday. A 5-year-old boy remained missing. Residents were evacuated from numerous communities because of flood risks as their streets turned into gushing streams. At the Best Western Plus Carpinteria Inn, several miles southeast of Montecito, a steady stream of people clad in rain gear pulled up in SUVs packed with luggage and provisions. Some who had evacuated said they were surprised to be among those ordered to leave because their homes were not in burn scars, areas hit by wildfire that are made more susceptible to landslides. In the 2018 storm that led to the devastating mudslide, officials had issued mandatory evacuation orders for about 7,000 residents in Montecito and voluntary ones for another 23,000, but many disregarded them because they had just returned home after being forced to leave during a wildfire. Montecito is a popular haven for celebrities, including Prince Harry and his wife, Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, Oprah Winfrey, and Ellen DeGeneres, who posted a video on Twitter of a raging creek behind her house that she said, never flows, ever. Evacuation orders were also in place in neighboring Ventura County, including in the tiny community of La Conchita, the site of a 2005 landslide around the same time of year that killed 10 people. In Santa Cruz County, about 70 miles south of San Francisco, more than 30,000 residents were placed under evacuation orders as creeks and rivers topped their banks, threatened homes and washed away at least one bridge. Mudslides blocked 2 highways in the Santa Cruz Mountains that connect the region to the San Francisco Bay Area. The flooding in the county besieged an area already reeling from some of the heaviest damage from recent storms. Just last week, the confluence of a storm surge, high tides and high surf collapsed piers and flooded hundreds of homes and businesses. The storm's impacts continued farther south along the state's central coast, with evacuation orders along rivers in Watsonville and Monterey County. Numerous roads were closed amid flash flood warnings in San Luis Obispo County, where the 5-year-old boy remained missing after he and his mother escaped from a car that was starting to be swept away by floodwaters. His mother, who had been driving him to school around 8 a.m., was rescued by nearby residents, but the boy was carried away by waters coursing down a rising creek, said Tony Cipala, public information officer with the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office. Divers with the agency's underwater search and rescue team scoured the nearby waters for hours, but had to call off the search around 3 p.m. when the rising waters and rapid current made it too dangerous, he said. Rivers and creeks in the area were gushing like they hadn't in decades, said Scott Jalbert, the county's emergency services manager. They're pretty monstrous, he said. California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo shut down for the day. The university reported that students, faculty and animals were being evacuated from agricultural facilities with a reservoir about to breach. Santa Cruz has long been far rainier than its neighboring counties, mostly because of its topography, said Jan Null, a veteran meteorologist and former lead forecaster for the National Weather Service. Storms coming from the Pacific Ocean slam into the Santa Cruz Mountains, forcing the air to lift and become colder, which creates more precipitation. The drastic differences in precipitation in places just 10 miles apart is a phenomenon rarely seen outside California, driven by the proximity of the ocean and mountains. The ferocity of the waves and severity of structural damage recalled, for some residents, memories of the disastrous 1982 storm that flooded rivers, badly damaged a bridge and killed 22 people, including 10 in a landslide that occurred just as a 30-hour rainstorm let up. In January of that year, the hillside above Love Creek, about 10 miles north of Santa Cruz, turned to liquid, with approximately 600,000 cubic yards of land, enough to fill 60,000 dump trucks, sliding down the mountain. Santa Cruz is also prone to flooding because its creeks and its biggest waterway, the San Lorenzo River, are not big enough to contain all of the water from heavy rainfall, experts say. Over the weekend, the river was so swollen that surfers were riding waves headed out to sea, rather than the other direction, and emergency responders warned of flood risks along the banks on Monday. Parts of West Cliff Drive, a winding Santa Cruz road at the edge of the cliffs overlooking the ocean, were closed after chunks of the street were wiped out by 20-foot-tall waves. Earlier storms had already pounded at the cliffs and washed away some barriers, like riprap, giant rocks placed at the edge of the cliffs to protect against erosion, a frightening sight for some residents. In Capitola, as rain began to drench the streets once again, Dominic King was rushing to save anything he could from his restaurant, Mai Tai Beach, before the next storm. The restaurant, along with many others next to the beach, was soaked by floodwater that crept up from the foundation, severing plumbing and warping the floor. Sacramento, the Coast Redwood crashed through the roof and into Nicole Valentine's bedroom while she was away at a party, trying to ignore the powerful storms that were hammering Northern California with fierce winds and rain. On the phone, her neighbor was almost incoherent. By Friday morning, tens of thousands of customers, mostly in Northern California, were still without power as communities prepared for yet another round of drenching rain. Forecasters with the National Weather Service in the Bay Area said the next atmospheric river was expected to arrive late Friday and spread south to central California on Saturday, raising the risk of more flooding and mudslides across the northern section of the state. Farther inland and around the Sacramento area, conditions were expected to be equally dangerous. Falling trees slammed into power lines on the Central Coast, shut down Highway 101 in Humboldt County and snarled rail service in Burlingame and San Francisco. They injured a California Highway Patrol officer at a crash scene in San Jose and ensnared cars on rain-soaked roads in Marin County. On Wednesday, fire officials said, a redwood in the Sonoma County community of Occidental crashed into a mobile home, killing a toddler. In Sacramento, which bills itself as the city of trees, the atmospheric rivers claimed nearly 1,000 trees in 6 days, according to the city's urban forester, Kevin Hawker, who called the toll much more than we've seen in other storms. He estimated that 60 fell in one city park alone. On the state capitol grounds, a short distance from the spot where Governor Gavin Newsom was being inaugurated for a second term on Friday, a giant sequoia lay uprooted, felled by the storms and surrounded with hazard tape and scattered drifts of branches. Its fall sheared the limbs off one side of a nearby Torrey pine. Paula Pepper, a retired U.S. Forest Service urban ecologist in Sacramento, estimated that the giant sequoia had stood for 80 to 100 years, through as many as 18 governors. At Sacramento City College, a downed cedar, huge and fragrant, blocked the entrance to campus. In a manicured neighborhood near the American River, Marco Leva, a local landscaper, scrambled to retrieve fallen tree limbs, his truck piled high with redwood, oak and liquid amber. Some, he said, appeared to have fallen partway in the New Year's Eve storm, and then the wind this time just knocked them down. The toll on trees is more than ornamental and nostalgic. At critical juncture in adapting to climate change, scientists say that trees are a physical barometer and manifestation of failure and success. In California cities, the urban canopy is a critical piece of environmental infrastructure, cooling sidewalks, cleansing air, creating wildlife habitat and giving people of all socioeconomic backgrounds respite from intensifying heat waves. In more remote places, where disease and drought have already turned vast tracts of wilderness into kindling, the fallen trees, unless they are quickly cleared, invite wildfire and pests. In a news conference, Ms. Namath, the state water resources director, blamed the horticultural devastation on the drought as well as the violent weather. "We're moving from extreme drought to extreme flood," she said. "What that means is, a lot of our trees are stressed." At the same time, weather systems shifted by climate change have amplified wind and precipitation, said Jeffrey Mount, a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. Last weekend's storm was very wet, essentially, an atmospheric fire hose hanging over California, but this week's bomb cyclone storm brought much more wind. Brian Ferguson, a spokesman for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, said the thousands of downed trees have been among the biggest challenges the state has encountered in managing public safety in this storm system. Falling trees not only threaten buildings and power lines, he said, but also can damage levees by toppling near waterways where branches and debris can be propelled downstream. The new climate reality, he said, has meant that disasters intertwine and compound one another. Drought worsens and lengthens fire seasons. Global warming intensifies heat waves. Precipitation that can no longer fall as snow lands as a deluge, and flora and fauna strain to survive the ecological disruption. The current disasters, and the living things that endure them, underscore the reality that we are one planet. I'm not a scientist, just a dad with 2 eyes and a brain, but it's so clear that the world is changing around us. Stressed by drought, whipped by wind and weakened at the roots by relentless rain and flooding, trees, tall and short, ancient and young, in mountain preserves and suburban yards, have toppled across California this week in breathtaking numbers, the most visible sign of a state veering between environmental extremes. A procession of atmospheric rivers has interrupted an epic drought responsible for the driest 3 years on California record. The sudden swing from scarcity to excess with back-to-back storms is testing the state's infrastructure broadly, straining the power grid, levees, drainage systems and roads from the Pacific coast to the Sierra Nevada. On Thursday, the pressure mounted as rain swelled rivers and snowy whiteouts obscured mountain passes. In San Francisco, trains were delayed amid system-wide disruptions on the Bay Area rapid transit. In Santa Cruz County, a tidal surge carried off parts of piers and forced the city of Santa Cruz to close its wharf as a safety measure. In Southern California, huge waves threatened lifeguard towers in Los Angeles County and flooded the Pacific Coast Highway in Huntington Beach, as the rain moved southward. By Friday morning, tens of thousands of customers, mostly in Northern California, were still without power as communities prepared for yet another round of drenching rain. Forecasters with the National Weather Service in the Bay Area said the next atmospheric river was expected to arrive late Friday and spread south to central California on Saturday, raising the risk of more flooding and mudslides across the northern section of the state. Farther inland and around the Sacramento area, conditions were expected to be equally dangerous. If the storm had a theme, it was in the uprooted and broken trees that seemed to blanket the rain-soaked landscape, a loss and a hazard that the director of the State Water Resources Department, Carla Namath, had warned would be the signature of this particular event. Falling trees slammed into power lines on the Central Coast, shut down Highway 101 in Humboldt County and snarled rail service in Burlingame and San Francisco. They injured a California Highway Patrol officer at a crash scene in San Jose and ensnared cars on rain-soaked roads in Marin County. On Wednesday, fire officials said, a redwood in the Sonoma County community of Occidental crashed into a mobile home, killing a toddler. In the Fruitvale neighborhood of Oakland, a tree crashed through a public housing apartment on Wednesday, where Victoria James lives with her adult daughter, her 2 younger children and her 3-year-old granddaughter. Everything shook and went black, Ms. James said. I thought it was an earthquake. When she saw branches poking through her ceiling and more limbs falling, she said, she grabbed the children and started running. In Sacramento, which bills itself as the city of trees, the atmospheric rivers claimed nearly 1,000 trees in 6 days, according to the city's urban forester, Kevin Hawker, who called the toll much more than we've seen in other storms. He estimated that 60 fell in one city park alone. On the state capitol grounds, a short distance from the spot where Governor Gavin Newsom was being inaugurated for a second term on Friday, a giant sequoia lay uprooted, felled by the storms and surrounded with hazard tape and scattered drifts of branches. Its fall sheared the limbs off one side of a nearby Torrey pine. Paula Pepper, a retired U.S. Forest Service urban ecologist in Sacramento, estimated that the giant sequoia had stood for 80 to 100 years, through as many as 18 governors. At Sacramento City College, a downed cedar, huge and fragrant, blocked the entrance to campus. In a manicured neighborhood near the American River, Marco Leyva, a local landscaper, scrambled to retrieve fallen tree limbs, his truck piled high with redwood, oak and liquid amber. Some, he said, appeared to have fallen partway in the New Year's Eve storm, and then the wind this time just knocked them down. The toll on trees is more than ornamental and nostalgic. At critical juncture in adapting to climate change, scientists say that trees are a physical barometer and manifestation of failure and success. In California cities, the urban canopy is a critical piece of environmental infrastructure, cooling sidewalks, cleansing air, creating wildlife habitat and giving people of all socioeconomic backgrounds respite from intensifying heat waves. In more remote places, where disease and drought have already turned vast tracts of wilderness into kindling, the fallen trees, unless they are quickly cleared, invite wildfire and pests. In a news conference, Ms. Namath, the state water resources director, blamed the horticultural devastation on the drought as well as the violent weather. "We're moving from extreme drought to extreme flood," she said. "What that means is, a lot of our trees are stressed." At the same time, weather systems shifted by climate change have amplified wind and precipitation, said Jeffrey Mount, a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. Last weekend's storm was very wet, essentially, an atmospheric fire hose hanging over California, but this week's bomb cyclone storm brought much more wind, drive. Mount said. The 1-2 punch of ever more saturated soil and speeding winds, scientists say, has made it tougher for trees to stay upright. It is not a surprise when we start getting these 50 to 70 mile-per-hour gusts that these big, old trees that are stressed and have their feet planted in what is essentially mud at this point, they fall over, drive. Mount said. An astonishing number of these big trees go toes up in these big storms. Emily Griswold, director of horticulture and teaching gardens at the University of California, Davis Arboretum, said that the swings between climate extremes have left even healthy trees more vulnerable. On New Year's Eve, some 15 thriving trees at the Arboretum uprooted, including a beautiful, healthy, Guadalupe Island cypress planted in 1936. She and her colleagues researched which trees and plants would be best to help shade cities and which would be able to thrive in a rapidly changing California. Much of their research so far has focused on extreme heat and drought. But the recent storms have shown that those inquiries must expand, she said. It's like heat, drought, flood, hell or high water, Ms. Griswold said. We're definitely looking closely at what fails, why did it fail, what can we learn from this, and how can we plant more wisely in the future. Brian Ferguson, a spokesman for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, said the thousands of downed trees have been among the biggest challenges the state has encountered in managing public safety in this storm system. Falling trees not only threaten buildings and power lines, he said, but also can damage levees by toppling near waterways where branches and debris can be propelled downstream. The new climate reality, he said, has meant that disasters intertwine and compound one another. Drought worsens and lengthens fire seasons. Global warming intensifies heat waves. Precipitation that can no longer fall as snow lands as a deluge, and flora and fauna strain to survive the ecological disruption. All of these precipitation hazards have been accompanied by strong winds. Winter rain and snow typically provide much of the water used throughout the year in California, which has suffered several years of punishing drought. But when these storms, which are known as atmospheric rivers, are particularly severe or sweep through in rapid succession, they can do more harm than good, delivering too much water, too quickly, for the state's reservoirs and emergency responders to handle. So far, this winter's storms have been largely in line with past ones except in their unrelenting pace, said Michael Anderson, California's state climatologist. This is where we're getting hit this year. We're seeing a lot of big storms fairly quickly. These storms get their name from their long, narrow shape and the prodigious amount of water they carry. They form when winds over the Pacific draw a filament of moisture from the band of warm, moist air over the tropics and channel it toward the west coast. When this ribbon of moisture hits the Sierra Nevada and other mountains, it is forced upward, cooling it and turning its water into immense quantities of rain and snow. Climate scientists also distinguish atmospheric rivers from other kinds of storms by the amount of water vapor they carry. These amounts form the basis for a 5-point scale used to rank atmospheric rivers from weak to exceptional. As humans continue burning fossil fuels and heating the atmosphere, the warmer air can hold more moisture. This means storms in many places, California included, are more likely to be extremely wet and intense. Scientists are also studying whether global warming might be shifting the way winds carry moisture around the atmosphere, potentially influencing the number of atmospheric rivers that sweep through California each year and how long they last. They have not yet come to firm conclusions on these questions, though. The dominant thing that's happening is just that, in a warmer atmosphere, there's exponentially more potential for it to hold water vapor, said Daniel L. Swain, a climate scientist at the University of California, Los Angeles. And that exerts a really profound influence on things. Atmospheric rivers are hugely influential for California's weather and water supplies. They cause the state's heaviest rains and feed the biggest floods. They drive its cycles of dry and wet, famine and feast. But they also cause a large share of the state's levee breaches and debris flows. One atmospheric river can be enough to flood homes, down power lines and wash away hillsides and highways. But when several sweep ashore in a matter of days or weeks, as appears to be happening this week, the potential damage is multiplied. Soils already saturated with rainwater might not be able to absorb any more, leading to floods and landslides. Rivers and streams already swollen after one storm could overflow. In the high mountains, rain could fall on snow, melting it and causing water to cascade toward communities below. Emergency services could be stretched to the breaking point. When big storms come one right after the other, it is also harder for infrastructure to channel all that water into the ground or into reservoirs where it can be kept in reserve for dry summers. It's really helpful if the storms would be so kind as to space themselves out a week or two apart so we have time for water to move through the system, said Janine Jones, an official with California's Department of Water Resources. A pile-on of wet weather caused catastrophic flooding across California and the Pacific Northwest in the winter of 1861-62, when deluges swept away homes and farms and turned valleys into vast lakes. As global warming continues, scientists say the risk of a replay of those floods is rising. In a study published last year, Drive. Swain and Xingying Huang of the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, estimated that California today had a roughly 1 in 50 chance each year of experiencing a storm of comparable intensity to 1861-62. Climate change has already doubled those odds compared with a century ago, they estimated. It is still unclear how global warming might be affecting the likelihood for atmospheric rivers to crash into California in rapid fire clusters. Another study last year found that in nearly 4 out of 5 years between 1981 and 2019, half or more of all atmospheric rivers that affected the state were part of an atmospheric river family, or a rapid parade of storms. Still, the warmer atmosphere's increased capacity for holding moisture is reason enough for California officials to prepare for more catastrophic rain events today and in the future, Drive. Swain said. When disaster strikes, household pets' lives are among the most vulnerable. Evacuating animals during any type of emergency, whether a hurricane, wildfire or earthquake, adds a layer of stress in a turbulent situation. However, experts with animal advocacy organizations say that taking care of our furry, feathered and scaly housemates is an imperative life-saving effort that can be conducted smoothly with advanced planning. Every attempt should be made not to leave animals behind, the advocates say. You might not be able to return home for longer than you anticipate, and abandoning pets can have devastating consequences, said Kelly Donathan, Director of Animal Disaster Response for the Humane Society of the United States. If you're leaving for any reason, don't think that it's safe to leave them behind, Ms. Donathan said. Experts emphasize that successfully evacuating with your pets depends on actions you can take well before the threat of an emergency is imminent. Every story is going to be unique, said Dr. Lori Teller, president of the American Veterinary Medical Association. Planning ahead definitely makes the whole ordeal a lot easier. Ensure your pets are wearing collars with clear, current identification and your contact information. A GPS collar could also come in handy, especially if you have a fearful pet that is prone to making escape attempts in stressful situations, said Jason Cohen, a dog trainer based in New York City. You'll need a sturdy leash and a pet carrier or crate labeled with your contact information. Consider getting a backup attachment for your pet's collar, such as a metal carabiner or double clip accessory, for added security if a collar accidentally comes off. Your pets might not be accustomed to traveling, so building their familiarity with different modes of transportation could help. Know the various evacuation routes and practice them in advance. Emergencies can happen at any time, so this kit should be updated regularly and kept in a convenient, easily accessible place in your home, advocates said. The kit should include enough non-perishable food and water to last at least a week. It should also contain food and water receptacles, a first aid kit, a couple of weeks' supply of medications, if needed, a printed document or USB stick with medical records, such as a rabies vaccine certificate, key details about your pet's diet, any behavioral issues and contact information for your veterinarian, all enclosed in a waterproof container. A toy or two for those idle hours. Hygiene supplies such as poop bags or a litter box. A current picture of you and your pet, in case you later need to prove ownership or reclaim it. This has been a DaveTube News Update. Make sure to follow us for more news breaks just like this. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and be blessed.